The President of the United States is responsible for the well-being and growth of his population under all circumstances. While some of these presidents took the oath of the office into their daily actions, others fell short on their promises. Sit down and relax as we bring you the very best and the very worst US presidents to ever lead the nation according to their IQ. You'll be surprised by some of these. Seeing as the so-called least smart president on this list still has an IQ of 130, a full 15 points above average, you can get an idea of just how smart we're talking about when it comes to American presidents. Ulysses S Grant, a former Union Army commanding general during the Civil War, became the 18th president of the United States. He enjoyed plenty of popularity when he was in office from 1869 to 1877. A couple of years after his graduation from West Point, he made a name for himself when he was active during the Mexican-American War. He became the president of the country at only 47 years old, making him the youngest president. He scored highly for moral authority, international relations, public persuasion, and pursuing equal justice for everyone. He is remembered by the general public as an honest person who condemned the KKK. Many also note that he was the first president to appoint both African American and Jewish American public officials. Rutherford B Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, was a Republican politician who served from 1877 to 1881. After several months of dispute, he ended up winning the electoral vote. Interestingly, the author Mark Twain expressed his support for Hayes. Before assuming the presidency, he was the Ohio governor for 3 terms, and he was affiliated with the now-defunct Whig Party. Hayes supported the expansion of the civil rights of the black community, but the Democratic majority in Congress interfered with his efforts. Rutherford B Hayes had a lower IQ compared to the other presidents, seeing as it was 133.9. Hayes was another famous supporter of the civil service exams as he believed it was important and just for government employees to earn the jobs through merit over political ties. This was later enacted in the Pendleton Act. His wife was the first FLOTUS to have received a college education, and she vouched for the first alcohol-free term in the White House. George W. Bush is the 43rd U.S. president, and he was the commander-in-chief during the tragic September 11 attacks on the Twin Towers back in 2001. He served for 2 consecutive terms, and he was in office from 2001 to 2008. Other important events that happened during his presidency were the invasion of Afghanistan and the Second Gulf War, which resulted in the deposition of the Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. Bush, as a response to 9/11, established the Department of Homeland Security. He spent 5 years as the Texas governor before he won the presidential election in 2000. With an IQ of 138.5, George W. Bush is another president with a lower than average IQ compared to all other presidents. George H. W. Bush, his father, was the president about 10 years before his term, and he is the second POTUS to have been the child of another president. Tuesday morning, September 11, 2001. Everyone remembers the day that Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. 2 airplanes were flown into the World Trade Centers in New York City and thousands died. At the time of the attack, the president was at Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota County, Florida. Did you know that James Monroe was in office between 1817 and 1825? This founding father was the 5th president of the United States. He used to be a popular choice for the position, and he won the election by a landslide. His time in office was later dubbed the era of good feelings. Monroe fought during the American Revolutionary War, and he became famous for the Monroe Doctrine, his foreign policy. Since he had an IQ of 138.6, Monroe just edged George W. Bush for the 3rd lowest score. All the same, a score of 138.6 doesn't make him a slouch either. It's considered very superior intelligence, according to the Wechsler IQ classification. After Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson became president. However, he became the first president of the United States to be impeached. The reason for this being his plans to restore the seceded states to the Union without granting protection to former slaves. This plan came under fire in Congress. To top it off, his IQ was only 138.9. While he appears rather low on the list, William Howard Taft had an IQ of 139.5 and remains the only person to have presided over both the executive and judicial branches of government. After being the president from 1909 to 1913, he later became the 10th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. William H. Taft was the 27th President of the United States, and he was the only head of state who went on to become the U.S. Chief of Justice. He grew up in Ohio and later matriculated at Yale University to take up law. He was allegedly part of the secret society Skull and Bones while attending the prestigious university. The 15th president didn't improve much from his predecessor. Most historians will recall that James Buchanan had made some lofty goals for himself as president. James Buchanan was the only president in United States history to never get married. The 15th president never explained why he chose never to find a wife, but maybe it was because he was simply too focused on his career and his presidency to worry about his social life. Zachary Old Rough and Ready Taylor was the 12th president of the United States, but he is most popular for spending only a brief period in the office. Before he launched his political career, he was a war hero and his leadership skills in the field earned him his nickname. He was praised for his bravery during the Mexican-American War, and he was the last Whig Party member to have been elected president. He began his term in March 1849 and he paid a great deal of attention to the slavery problem. While he kept slaves himself, his position leaned more towards the anti-slavery side of the debate. During his term, he encouraged New Mexico and California to become states. Sadly, Taylor succumbed to cholera while he was still in office in July 1850. Despite being considered to be a war hero, Zachary Taylor had a rather low IQ compared to those who have held the presidency. His IQ was 139.8. Zachary Taylor's unexpected death led to plenty of rumors circulating around the cause of the sickness. Some people believed he must have consumed contaminated ice water or milk, while others thought the big amount of cherries he ate during the 4th of July celebration was to blame. The 33rd President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, was in office from 1945 to 1953. He was elected into power just after the conclusion of the Second World War. He served in the Army during the First World War, and he is the only president who has ever used nuclear weapons. He was known for his stubbornness and he apparently used the power to veto about 180 times. Having had an IQ of 139.8, Harry Truman falls in the lower 25% of U.S. presidents. The 29th election ended in the declaration of Warren G. Harding. Interestingly, this was a significant presidential race since it was the first election in which women could vote. Warren Harding launched his career in the newspaper industry in Ohio as the owner of the Marion Star newspaper. He departed the rural town to enter politics when the right time came. During his term, Harding declared the end of the First World War when he announced that the United States was at peace with Austria, Germany, and Hungary. His cabinet suffered numerous scandals throughout the years, but Harding succumbed to a heart attack before they were revealed to the public. His IQ is estimated to be around 139.9, the lower end of the presidential IQs. Now get ready for the next list of the US president with the higher IQ and their achievements. George Washington is yet another founding father and, as we all know, the very first president of the United States. During the research, he ended up ranked as the second best president in the history of the United States. You might have had the impression that George Washington was some kind of genius since he was one of the founding fathers and all that. To a certain extent, you're right. He had an IQ of 140, meaning he was much smarter than the average person. All the same, he's not near the top of the list of presidents. After the resignation of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford succeeded him as the 38th President of the United States. He held the position from 1974 to 1977, during which he pardoned his predecessor. Ford was known for his role in the Helsinki Accords, an attempt to improve the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ford hailed from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he pursued a law career that served as a gateway for a political career. He led the people through terrible economic turmoil, and this helped improve his ranking by a significant amount. His IQ of 140.4 puts him on the lower end of the presidential list, but it is worth noting that he does score higher than a quarter of all the other presidents. Ford is the only person who became both vice president and president without being elected. President Gerald Ford didn't expect the events of September 5, 1975. While walking through a cheering crowd in Sacramento, California, a woman with a Colt M1911 pistol attempted to shoot him. The gun didn't fire, and she was apprehended. The woman was Lynette "Squeaky" Frome, a follower of the cult run by Charles Manson. It's hard to believe that just 17 days after the assassination attempt on President Ford, another woman would take their shot at his life. Again in California, Sarah Jane Moore pulled out a pistol and fired one shot at the president. She missed and was quickly overpowered by a former Marine. The bullet missed a president but injured a taxi driver. This president became famous for taking over after John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in 1963. Lyndon B. Johnson then ramped up the U.S. presence in Vietnam. With an IQ of 140.6, we're still on the lower end of the list of presidents. The 36th President of the United States is none other than Lyndon Baines Johnson, better known as LBJ. He was in office between 1963 and 1969, during which he left an impressive legacy. He is lauded for his efforts to push the country in many important areas. When he was the head of state, he passed numerous civil rights, gun, and welfare laws. Of course, we can't forget the way he passed the Social Security law and expanded Medicaid and Medicare. Herbert Hoover was in office during one of the most difficult times in the history of the United States. The 31st U.S. president grew up in Iowa and Oregon before attending the prestigious Stanford University in the opening year of the academic institution. He later married Lou Henry, his college girlfriend. What you might not have known about Herbert Hoover is that he had an estimated IQ of 141.6. While that's high overall, it's pretty average in terms of presidents. He spent significant time in China before he launched his political career, and he was in Europe during the eruption of the Great War. He earned some fame when he helped 120,000 American tourists evacuate France and Germany. He served from 1929 until 1933 during the stock market crash that led to the Great Depression. It was a trying time, but Hoover nonetheless tried several methods to help out his countrymen, like lowering the taxes and convincing businesses to keep their employees. It took a while for things to change, so Hoover had to maintain his composure during a time of economic turmoil. As vice president, Calvin Coolidge was next line after the untimely death of President Warren Harding back in 1923. The following year, he was elected as the president and he remained in office until 1929. With an IQ of 141.6, he was still below average in terms of presidents. He supported the laissez-faire foreign policy and small government, so he was a popular political figure by the time his term ended. Many saw his administration as a time when the government had dignity, even though the White House suffered several years filled with scandal. His soft-spoken demeanor contrasted with his passion for racial equality and civil rights. Regardless, he did not always win the approval of his fellow government officials, particularly when he wanted to turn lynching into a federal crime. Another important achievement under his administration was the passing of the Indian Citizenship Act, which granted American citizenship to the Native Americans living on the reservation. Here is what his biographer had to say about him. He embodied the spirit and hopes of the middle class, could interpret their longings and express their opinions. That he did represent the genius of the average is the most convincing proof of his strength. From 1981 to 1989, Ronald Reagan was in office as the 40th President of the United States. Among other things, he earned a name for himself thanks to his Reaganomics economic policy. It focused on lower social spending, domestic markets deregulation, high military spending, and widespread tax cuts. Seeing as he had an IQ of 141.9, Reagan fell somewhere between the bottom and quarter in half when compared to his fellow presidents. He also deserves credit for the Iran-Contra affair and the end of the Cold War. He gave an iconic speech at the Berlin Wall during which he told Soviet General Secretary Gorbachev to tear down this wall. On March 30, 1981, an attempt was made on the life of President Ronald Reagan by John Hinckley Jr. Unlike what you think, the would-be assassin took a shot at the president in order to impress young actress Jodie Foster. The president was hit by a ricocheted bullet, but he survived. Later he would say to his wife, "I forgot to duck." Ronald Reagan, one of the former presidents of the United States, was suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and a complication arose which led to him getting pneumonia. On June 5, 2004, Ronald Reagan passed away due to his Alzheimer's and pneumonia. He had Alzheimer's for 10 years and passed away at the age of 93. He is buried at the Ronald Reagan National Library in California. The 37th President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon, was respected for his talent when it comes to foreign affairs negotiation. He held the position from 1969 to 1974, during which he ended the involvement of the country in the Vietnam War. He also started diplomatic relations with China, signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty with the USSR, and took home the prisoners of war. Even as the vice president to President Dwight D Eisenhower from 1953 until 1961, he was able to accomplish numerous impressive achievements. He is credited for the implementation of desegregation in the South, helped fund the Environmental Protection Agency, launched the war on cancer, and signed the anti-crime bill. In 1960, he ran for another term, but he lost the elections to the Democrat candidate, John F. Kennedy. If it weren't for the Watergate scandal, you can bet Nixon would have placed higher. There probably isn't a single American who doesn't know about the Watergate scandal. It was this event that eventually caused the Richard Nixon to resign as President of the United States. He was the first president to ever do so. President Gerald Ford acquitted him though. George H.W. Bush Sr. served as the President of the United States for a term that ran from 1989 to 1993. However, members of the younger generation will probably remember him better as the father of President George W. Bush. Before he was elected the head of state, the older Bush previously served as vice president for Ronald Reagan for 8 years. He was known for his leadership skills during times of crisis. He was a great negotiator, especially when it came to international relations. While he was a controversial figure, he wasn't dumb. George H.W. Bush had an IQ of 143, making him more or less average in terms of U.S. presidents. George H.W. Bush's term in office coincided with the end of the Cold War, the First Gulf War, and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. He was also credited for several important acts like the Clean Air Act, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Aside from these feats, he also holds the longest presidential marriage record at 73 years. On November 30, 2018, it was announced that former President George H.W. Bush had passed away after a long fight with vascular Parkinson's disease, just 7 months after his wife, Barbara, passed away. He was the first former president to pass away since Gerald Ford in 2006. James K. Polk, the 11th President of the United States, served the nation from 1845 to 1849. He had an IQ of 143.4. Interestingly, his inauguration to the office was the first one to ever be broadcasted on the news via telegraph. Polk famously led the country to victory in the U.S.-Mexican War. The U.S. saw territory expansion under his term thanks to the 1848 Mexican Cession and the Texas annexation. From 1897 until 1901, William McKinley Jr. was the 25th President of the United States and had an IQ of 143.4. He was the last person to lead America during the Civil War, and he also helped America win the Spanish-US War. When he was in office, the U.S. saw huge developments when Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico all became territories. He was also well received for his efforts to improve the economy, though he did not do a lot to seek equal justice for all American citizens. President William McKinley was shot twice in his abdomen by anarchist Leon Cholgus on September 6, 1901. The event occurred at the Temple of Music in Buffalo, New York. Ironically, the president's secretary successfully convinced him not to go ahead with the trip on 2 separate occasions since he worried about this exact event. McKinley died 8 days after the shooting. With an IQ of 144, Grover Cleveland was very close to making it to the top 50% of presidents. Grover Cleveland served 2 terms as the president, and his first term ran from 1885 until 1889. He, however, did not serve consecutive terms as he lost his first bid for re-election, but later won again in 1893. Conservatives admired his fiscal policy and his desire for political reform. During his second term, Cleveland dealt with the Panic of 1893, which ended up becoming such a big economic crisis, as well as the Pullman Strike of 1894, a massive railroad strike on the national level. He was a descendant of one of the families who first moved from Europe to the New World as his forefathers arrived in Massachusetts. His biographer praised Cleveland and his public speaking skills. He possessed honesty, courage, firmness, independence, and common sense. But he possessed them to a degree other men do not. Despite his less popular second term, some consider Cleveland to be one of the best presidents the country ever had. Being the first, and only, president to get married in the White House is quite a big deal. But many were more interested in whom the president was marrying. She was a 21-year-old woman, 28 years his junior, and she was quite impressive. Aside from being very attractive, fluent in French and quite charismatic, she was also loved by the public. While it's still significantly higher than the average person, Andrew Jackson had an IQ of 145, which put him in the median of presidential IQs. Andrew Jackson was the President of the United States for a single term. He held the position from 1829 to 1837. We won't be surprised to hear that you recognize him from the $20 bill. Isn't it fascinating to learn that he opposed the creation of paper money and advocated for silver and gold coins instead? At 13 years old, he was the captive of the British in the Revolutionary War. That's right, this makes him the only president to have once been a prisoner of war. Among other things, he managed to prevent the secession of South Carolina and paid off all the national debt during his term. There was some charm about President Andrew Jackson that made the public feel like he was one of them. After he concluded his inauguration speech, he and his party moved to the executive mansion to start the celebrations, but things went awry. A massive crowd followed the group and stormed the mansion. Hay drank copious amounts of alcohol, ransacked the kitchen, dirtied the venue, and made a ruckus. They were eventually dispersed when the alcohol was moved outside. Dwight D Eisenhower was the 34th President of the United States. He held this title from 1953 to 1961. One of his most famous moves was the reversal of Truman's policy and the desegregation of the Army. Commonly known by the nickname Ike, he became one of the most respected men in the history of United States politics. Did you know he had an IQ of 145.1? Benjamin Harrison was the 23rd President of the United States, and he was in service with the Union Army during the Civil War. He is considered one of the best presidents in U.S. history thanks to his international relations and great working relationship with Congress during his term. Some of the most significant efforts of his administration were the enforcement of African American voting rights and the acceptance of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Washington, and Wyoming into the Union. Benjamin Harrison had an IQ of 145.4, topping Eisenhower and Jackson, but just making it to the top 50%. He was given the nickname Little Ben since he was the great-grandchild and namesake of the founding father Benjamin Harrison. He was the only POTUS to have a U.S. president for a grandfather as well. Of course, he is the grandson of none other than William Henry Old Topekano Harrison. President Martin Van Buren served for a single term between 1837 and 1841. He was in office during the huge economic crisis more commonly known as the Panic of 1837. It started only 3 months after he was sworn into office, and this was considered the first Great Depression in the history of the United States. Van Buren was nicknamed the Little Magician, and he advocated for the U.S. Treasury to become an independent institution in order to keep the funds separate while the political tides come and go through the year. Seeing as his IQ was 146, Martin Van Buren was pretty average among the presidents. He was appointed as the Secretary of State during Andrew Jackson's term before he succeeded him as the president, and then later became the minister to Great Britain later on. He inherited the Great Depression, and he was criticized for the closing down of a large number of businesses and banks thanks to the economic problems. However, the policies he said eventually brought the economy to life, even though he never received credit for this, as the effects only became noticeable once he was no longer the president. William Henry Harrison holds the record for the shortest term in the office. Most people remember him for his tragic death, which happened while he was still in service. He spent a total of 31 days in the office from March 4, 1841, to April 4, 1841. The ninth president succumbed to pneumonia after a rainy inauguration day. Apparently, the president refused to put on a warm jacket and rode a horse to give his speech. Another average president, William Henry Harrison, had an IQ of 146.3. Holding the record for the shortest term in office, William Henry Harrison was remembered mainly for tragedy, having died during his time in office. He was the last president who lived through the American Revolution, and he even earned some fame for leading the military to victory during the Battle of Tippecanoe back in 1811. The 14th President of the United States was nothing short of a controversial head of state. He called the abolitionist movement a fundamental threat to the unity of the nation. Knowing this, it makes sense that this Democratic president signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Franklin Pierce, having an IQ of 147.4, puts him above the average president by just 1 point. This act effectively allowed each state to decide what its stance on slavery was. John Tyler took on the title of the 10th President of the United States after the demise of William Henry Harrison. He was actually the first person to replace a president who died while in office. In other words, he was the first president who had not been elected, and he was the head of state from 1841 to 1845. Regarding slavery, Tyler allowed the states to decide about this and several other issues. He earned quite a number of enemies in Congress thanks to his passive stance, and he was dubbed His Excellency. Did you know that John Tyler is the father of 15 kids? That makes him the president with the most amount of children. They were all born between the years 1815 and 1860, and they were from 2 different wives. His first 8 children were with his first wife, Letcha Tyler, and the last 7 were with his second wife, Julia Gardner. Millard Fillmore was the last president from the Whig Party before it was dissolved. He was born into a poor family and educated himself well enough to attain the rank of vice president during the term of President Zachary Taylor. After the incumbent president died of cholera in 1850, Fillmore succeeded him as the 13th president. After the death of Taylor, all the cabinet members of the White House filed their resignation right away, leaving Fillmore to build a completely new one. While his IQ of 149 is rather low in the presidential range, it's definitely nothing to sneer at. From 1850 to 1853, he tried but failed to prevent tension between the North and the South by signing the 1850 Compromise. He also helped develop contact with Japan, who was still isolating itself at the time. Under his presidency, Japan started allowing American ships to dock in the country in case of emergencies. Sit right and fasten your belt as we take you through the last list of the US presidents with the highest IQ in history. As the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Abe Lincoln managed to attain quite an impressive number of milestones. When he was in office from 1861 to 1865, he instigated the long road to the abolition of slavery and led the Union during the Civil War. He passed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, a move that established a framework for ending slavery by granting the Savs in the South the status of free people. He also outlawed slavery by putting the 13th Amendment into the Constitution. Unfortunately, his assassination in 1865 cut his term short and prevented him from witnessing the effects of all his efforts. Regardless, his legacy continues to live on, and polls even revealed that he is still the most popular and best-liked president of the United States. Seeing as he had an IQ of 150, it means he wasn't just one of the smartest presidents, he was one of the smartest people. It's very likely that Abraham Lincoln's assassination is one of the most notable moments in American history. While watching a performance of Our American Cousin at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., President Lincoln was shot by actor John Wilkes Booth. The president died hours later, and only 5 days after the end of the Civil War. Commonly known as FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt served as the 32nd President of the United States from 1933 to 1945. He was actually so popular back then that he was elected a total of 4 times. FDR led the country through the Great Depression, the Prohibition, and the Second World War. He also launched the New Deal, which then set in motion many social and economic reforms. He had an IQ of 150.5, making him rank in the top quarter of U.S. presidents in terms of intelligence. He was known as one of the best presidents in American history, and his death would be one that the entire nation mourned over. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died as a result of an intracerebral hemorrhage. Sadly, the president would not get to experience the end of the Second World War. The 21st President of the United States, Chester Arthur, was born in Vermont to an Irish immigrant couple. People always told him he looked like a president, but he only played the part when he took over the presidency after the death of President James Garfield in 1881. The vice president turned president had been in office from 1881 to 1885, and he is best known for the creation of the Pendleton Act. He ensured that citizens would earn federal government positions through a system based on merit instead of their political affiliations and connections. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act also implemented the use of examinations to screen applicants. During his term, Arthur also legislated the first federal immigration law that aimed to bar paupers, criminals, and lunatics from making their way into the country. Did you know Chester Arthur had an IQ of 152.3? That's incredibly high, even for a president. Did you know that the 20th U.S. President James A. Garfield was the first and only sitting member of the House of Representatives elected into the presidency? Before his term, he was a major general for the Union during the American Civil War, and he fought in numerous battles like Chickamauga, Middle Creek, and Shiloh. During his term from March 4, 1881, until September 19, 1881, he was able to accomplish admirable things such as getting rid of corruption in the Postal Service and building up the Navy. He also advocated for universal education and civil rights. His appointment of several African Americans, such as Frederick Douglass, into government positions was notable as well. An assassination attempt took place in July 1881, and his term was cut short after he battled multiple infections. It turns out that Garfield was one of the smartest presidents with an IQ of 152.3. Theodore Roosevelt was in office from 1901 until 1909. Affectionately called Teddy, he received the admiration of the public for his persuasive speaking talent and administrative and international relations skills. He also scored highly for his overall vision and economic management skills. Among other things, he is credited for the creation of many national parks and forests as well as iconic monuments. He also launched the construction of the Panama Canal and expanded the naval forces. Interestingly, he also negotiated the conclusion of the Russo-Japanese War and earned a Nobel Peace Prize. His IQ was estimated to be 153. If you didn't know, President Theodore Roosevelt was all about physical contact sport. In one event, he was sparring with an officer from the Navy at the White House when he received a powerful blow to his left eye. In order to protect his ego, he didn't reveal until weeks later that he had completely lost vision in that eye. John Adams was the second person to have assumed the title of the President of the United States. He was in office from 1797 to 1801. This founding father is best remembered for building up the Navy during his term, an accomplishment that later earned him the moniker, the Father of the American Navy. He famously resolved the conflict between the United States and France. Unfortunately for him, Thomas Jefferson beat his bid for re-election after his first term. With an IQ of 155, He's in the top 25% in terms of presidential intelligence. Woodrow Wilson was in office during the First World War from 1913 to 1921. The 28th President of the United States also helped create the Treaty of Versailles during the tail end of the war. One of his most memorable quotes has to be, "At last the world knows America as the savior of the world." He will forever be remembered for his efforts to push the U.S. to join the League of Nations, the predecessor of the United Nations. Unfortunately, Congress blocked this move back then, and some people consider this to be part of the reason why World War II erupted. Wilson had an IQ of 155.2, which most likely helped him in seeing the country through World War I. Jimmy Carter is the 39th President of the United States, and he served from 1977 to 1981. He was born to a family of peanut farmers, and he helped build up the business while fighting alongside the civil rights movement. This helped him launch a political career. Among other achievements during his administration, he launched both the Department of Energy and the Department of Education. He deserves credit for the Camp David Accords that led to the 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty. During the C-SPAN survey, he scored high when it comes to both moral authority and pursuing equal justice. When he was in office, Carter had to deal with international crises like the Iran hostage crisis and the 1979 energy crisis. Having to handle these events negatively affected his public persona, and this ended with him losing the 1980 presidential race to the Republican candidate Ronald Reagan. Nonetheless, Carter was awarded the 2002 Nobel Peace Prize for the efforts of his NGO, Carter Center. It turns out that his IQ is an impressive 156.8. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter brokered one of the most impressive peace deals in the Middle East. Former President of Israel Menachem Begin and former Egyptian President Anwar Sadat signed a deal for peace under unique conditions. Israel returned the Sinai, which they captured during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and Egypt fully recognized Israel's right to exist. Both parties were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Bill Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States, served 2 terms between 1993 and 2001. When he was in office, America saw the longest period of economic growth under any president sworn into office. Here was what Helen Thomas, a White House reporter, had to say about him: "He has brought on the greatest prosperity we have ever known, and he doesn't get the credit for it, and that's too bad." Clinton was able to attain the highest approval rating of any president since the Second World War at 60%. With an IQ of 159, Clinton is the 5th smartest president of the United States. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal was one of the most publicized in American history. Despite first fervently denying any sort of relationship with the young Monica Lewinsky, the president eventually confessed. At the end of the debacle, Clinton said, "Even presidents have private lives." The 35th President of the United States was John F. Kennedy, and he held this position from 1961 to 1963. His term was tragically cut short after his assassination in 1963. The moment has forever lived on in our memories thanks to footage and various tributes to it over the years. It is interesting to learn that JFK is the only Roman Catholic president in U.S. history. He received plenty of praise for his excellent leadership skills in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis as well as the establishment of the Peace Corps. Having an IQ of 159.8 is something that impresses people to this day. The day that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald was one that brought the world to tears. The shot was taken as the presidential motorcade was passing through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas on October 22, 1963. James Madison ended up becoming the 4th President of the United States, and he held the position from 1809 until 1817. He was called the father of the Constitution, and many people admired his excellent leadership skills. He even became the first graduate student at Princeton University after finishing college with honors in only 2 years' time. He led the country in the War of 1812, established the National Bank, and strengthened both the military and government power. Dolly, his wife, also did excellently as the First Lady by setting an example for young women at the time. She was also responsible for the famous redecoration of the White House and numerous public outreach programs for orphans. His IQ of 160 makes him the second smartest president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States, and he was in office from 1801 to 1809. He was known for playing an important role in the creation of the Declaration of Independence as well as the expansion of U.S. territory after the Louisiana Purchase from France. He was an advocate for equality, freedom, and justice for everyone. Tying in second place, Jefferson had an IQ of 160 as well. The sixth president of the United States was none other than John Quincy Adams. He held the position from 1825 until 1829. Popularly known as JQA, he was the son of former president and founding father John Adams. The younger man was strongly against slavery and advocated for equal rights. He called himself the acutest, the astutest, the archest enemy of Southern slavery that ever existed. JQA liked to keep out of European affairs as he was a supporter of non-intervention policies. He expressed opposition to the Texas annexation, and he has the oldest surviving presidential photo under his belt. It dates all the way back to 1843, when he was aged 76. Having an IQ of 175 in the early 19th century meant you were smarter than 99.9999% of the population on Earth. The 44th President of the United States made history when he became the first African American person to be ever elected into office. Barack Obama served from 2009 to 2017, during which he made several historic moves. Among other things, he improved the health care system by introducing the Affordable Care Act. His other legacies include the brokerage of a nuclear deal with Iran, repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in the military, and fixing relations with Cuba. His exact IQ remains to be discovered, but with his previous accomplishments, there is no doubt that he is smart. Barack Obama's inauguration was blessed with Bayan singing the American anthem in front of the massive crowd. The first African American president spoke about many things, but the applause really came in when he said, "Our journey is not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like anyone else under the law." Donald J. Trump became the 45th President of the United States after beating Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton. Aside from being quite a controversial politician, he is also the first U.S. president to take office without any prior military or government position. While the current U.S. president has boasted a high IQ, a number has never. Donald J. Trump was officially sworn in as the 45th president on January 27, 2017. As part of his speech that focused especially on making America great again, he said, "From this day forward, it's going to be only America first, said Trump during his 17-minute speech after commencing his presidency. We hope you found this clip useful and enjoyable. Please don't forget to like and subscribe for more useful contents.